Next, Technology and Education. The House Science Committee, along with the House Economic and Educational Opportunity Committee, held the hearing today to examine technological advances in education. Witnesses include Alan Kay of Apple Computers. House Speaker Newt Gingrich gave opening remarks. This hearing runs 2 hours and 45 minutes.
Good morning. I'd like to welcome everyone to a hearing on educational technology. I think it's going to be a very exciting hearing. I was excited yesterday to have an opportunity to see the classroom of the future, and now to talk about some of the issues I think will make for a very worthwhile day. And I'm very pleased that Chairman Bill Goodling and the members of his committee, the Empowerment and Education Committee, have really cooperated with us in putting this together, and I'm pleased to welcome Chairman Goodling here today to be a part of this session. Also, the ranking member, Bill Clay, when he arrives, and of course, I'm sorry, there he is. All right, Bill, welcome, and of course, the ranking member of the Science Committee, George Brown. This is, as I say, I think an exciting glimpse into the future, and I'm delighted that we have the kind of cooperation. What we're going to try to do throughout the day is alternate in and out of the chair so that there is a shared jurisdiction over this. We want to make certain that people understand that we're examining not just the technology issues. This is really about education and how education deals with the future. Speaker Gingrich had hoped at some point that he was going to be able to come and testify. He's not going to be able to do that with the press of other things. He is going to try to get over at some point today to the classroom of the future in 2325. And any of you who have not had an opportunity to get there, we would certainly encourage you to go down and take a look at that display. It's very fascinating. What I'd like to do is begin by asking the committee chairman and the ranking members who are here for their opening statements. And so for the first statement, I will turn to Chairman Goodling.
How you doing, Bob? How are you, Bill? Good to see you. The reason, is that on? The reason Mr. Clay was delayed over there coming in is in our committee we usually have a drum roll when he comes in, and he was waiting for that drum roll. I have an opening statement I'll submit for the record because I know we have a lot of people to testify. Just indicate that I'm very interested in the subject and very interested in hearing the testimony. And then hopefully at the end you will all also give us some ideas of how you put the dysfunctional family back together again so that my wife doesn't have to appear in a first grade class with 18 students, 12 of which are from dysfunctional families, and try to figure out what it is she's going to do to make sure they all receive an excellent education. So I will submit my remarks for the record.
Very good. I thank Mr. Goodling. Mr. Brown, opening statement.
Mr. Chairman, recognizing the scope of what we're doing and not desiring to take up too much money, let me just too much time. Money was on my mind, I'll tell you. Let me welcome the distinguished witnesses that we have before us this morning. Let me indicate without amplifying on it that, as the chairman knows, this Committee on Science has had a long involvement with the questions of educational technologies and a strong record of support for them. And let me also ask unanimous consent to insert in the record a letter from the President's Science Advisor indicating their strong support for the programs for enhancing education which modern technology makes available to us. And with that, I'll ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Brown. Mr. Clay.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I also want to welcome the distinguished panelists today and look forward to their testimony. And I would like to also submit my statement for the record.
Thank you, Mr. Clay. And,
Mr. Clay didn't introduce our new member. Would you like to introduce our new member? Yes, he's down on the end.
Mr. Fattah is the new member of the Economic and, what is it, Educational Economic Opportunity Committee, EEOC. For the Republicans, that's an oxymoron. But I'd like to introduce our new committee member. This is his first meeting, Mr. Chaka Fattah from Pennsylvania. Welcome to the committee.
Sometimes he doesn't put oxy in front of that when he addresses us.
As two fellow Pennsylvanians, Chairman Goodling and I are happy to welcome you to the hearing today, and I'm sure to his committee.
Yeah, great school in Philly.
I, too, will ask unanimous consent to submit an opening statement for the record. I'm looking forward here today to a very lively session that will give us a greater understanding of the massive changes likely to take place in the K through 12 curriculum over the next 20 years. That awareness will help us with future education legislation and may determine very much the destiny of the country. With that, we would be pleased to welcome our first panel of witnesses. Other members with opening statement, I would say, we would ask you to submit them to the record so that we do have an opportunity to hear as many of our witnesses as possible. And without objection, we will take all opening statements that members may have prepared for the record. Mr. Fattah, do you have a question?
To thank the chairman and the ranking member for their gracious... I just wanted to thank the chairman and the ranking member for their gracious welcome to the committee. And the chairman, I know from my work with the FIA agency back in Pennsylvania, and the ranking member, Mr. Clay. I'm looking forward to working on the committee. Thank you.
Again, we welcome you here today. With that, we'd like to invite our first witnesses, a panel of witnesses to the table. We thank you very much for being with us today. I have an order on my panel that seems to kind of move across the table from my right to my left. So I think what we'll do is begin with Professor Papert. We would welcome your testimony.
Well, thank you. I see in front of me where there is no vision.
Would you turn on the mic? I think that is.
Oh, it needs to be on. Is there? I see in front of me where there is no vision, the people perish. There is no vision in the education establishment about where education is going. I think that's the main burden I'd like to make, and I'd like to illustrate it by a series of little parables rather than quote facts, which in the short time. The first parable is about people in the 19th century who were doing research on how to improve transportation. Somebody stumbled on the idea of a jet engine and had the great idea that if we attached the jet engine to the stagecoach, it would assist the horses by adding to their power. In fact, the opposition to this idea said, no, don't do that. Let's train the stagecoaches better. Let's study why the wheels squeak. Let's make better grease. Well, they won because they did experiments and they got results. And the other guy, the jet engine, caused the stagecoach to disintegrate. What we're doing with technology and education is exactly analogous. We're putting computers and other technology in a school system that was designed for a totally different epoch, where everything about it, the curriculum, its content, the idea of segregating children by ages, All this is the consequence of a system of knowledge technology called the blackboard, or the slate, or the pencil and paper, that required the dissemination of knowledge through presentation bit by a teacher, so it had to be divided into subjects, and the children had to be organized into grades, and what could be taught was severely restricted by the conditions under which under which knowledge was disseminated. I think that the problem is not how to stick the educational jet engine onto the educational stagecoach. The problem is to invent the educational jet engine, which is something that will be radically different in all its structure from what we see in schools today. I object strongly to what you saw being called a classroom of the future. It's a classroom of the very, very, very near future. I doubt if there'll be classrooms in the real future. There'll be something else. Obviously, there'll be places where children learn, but they won't resemble what we see today. I'd like to use one other little parable, and that's about, we have a strong opinion in this world that some people can do things like mathematics and some people can't, and some people can learn languages and some people can't. Just focus on mathematics. Why do we think some people don't have a head for mathematics? It's because they didn't learn mathematics in the mathematics classroom. But when we go into the French classroom and see how few children learn French, we do not conclude that they do not have a head for French, because we know that those very same children, if they grew up in France, would speak French perfectly. So this is a total non sequitur that runs right through the whole thinking about our education, people's abilities, and who can learn what at what age. The problem for mathematics education is not to find a better way of teaching mathematics in the classroom. The problem is to find the analog of learning French by growing up in France. It's to create a mathland. Mathland being to mathematics what France is to French, and this is the great contribution of the computer. It's not an automated teacher. It's not a way of presenting the same old curriculum. It's a mathematics-speaking being, a medium, an instrument that would give children and everybody the opportunity to learn subjects like mathematics that we have thought of as too hard, too formal, too abstract, to learn this in the same kind of natural way as children can learn to walk, to talk, to manipulate their parents, to do all the things that children learn to do, without any curriculum and without any of our quizzes or national standards. They just learn these things because they live in a learning environment. And our job is to convert this new technology into the infrastructure for that environment. But in order to do that, we have to understand that there's an entire education establishment there. And by that I mean the administrations of the schools and the professors in the schools of education and the government agencies, and this whole structure which has been built around supporting and understanding an outmoded system. And I think one has got to understand that this education establishment has very deep vested interest, not only for their jobs, but more important, in their vision. Their vision is how to improve and keep going the old system. Their vision is not how to envision and invent and foster the growth of something radically different. And I think that that is the vision that we have to have. It's very hard to know how to translate that vision into what to do on Monday in the classroom, and we have to face that dilemma. But I think we can, and I think that the leadership role that our government can give is to recognize that problem, to recognize that when we look into the not very distant future, 10 or 20 years, the present system will be totally antiquated in everybody's eyes. And I think we've got to foster the growth of something new in order to make an orderly transition possible. One last parable, which isn't really a parable. I'm very struck by the analogy between the current state of our school system and the situation of the Soviet Union maybe 10 years ago, when at the time that Gorbachev came into power, it had become apparent that the system is collapsing, that it can't operate. But it was also, although this is apparent from the outside, to the people inside, they tried to fix it by jiggering the details, by making local fixes within its bureaucracy. I think we're in exactly the same position in our choice of, and our approach to trying to fix our education system, which needs a far more radical examination of what it's about, what the problems are, why it is what it is. And if we do that, I think we might find that one of the reasons is exactly the same as what was wrong in the Soviet Union, where they had a command economy, where a committee somewhere decided on how many nails would be produced everywhere in the country. This cannot work in a modern world. But we in our education system are trying to run the closest thing to a command economy in the form of a command curriculum, where somehow we think we can dictate, whether it's at a federal or state or local level, doesn't matter, we think we can dictate a same curriculum for every child, irrespective of who that child is. I think this is impossible for exactly the same reason, is going to collapse. We have to recognize it's going to collapse and see, unless we make and foster very rapid change in the system, it will break down in the same sort of disorderly way that we are beginning to see in some cities now, and we saw in the collapse of that Soviet command economy. I think that's enough. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Papert. Dr. Kaye.
Thank you. I'd like to submit two documents for the record. One is a Scientific American article I wrote a few years ago, which I think covers a lot of the issues, and another one is a short piece I wrote for this hearing. But in my few
Without
minutes...
objection, they'll be included.
Thank you. For my short time here, I'd first like to say that I got started working with children in technology because of a visit to Seymour Papert in 1968, 27 years ago or so now, and I was struck immediately by his understanding and vision of how education and this new computer technology is going to play itself out. And I think he was right then, and I think he is right now. There's some real problems in making it work. I mean, if the issue were music, for instance, if America's parents were worried that their children wouldn't make it in life unless they became musicians by the time they left high school, we could imagine Congress or some state legislature coming up with the solution of let's put a piano in every classroom. And they would say, but unfortunately we don't have enough money to train the existing teachers or hire musicians, so what we'll do is we'll just give the existing teachers 2-week refresher courses in the summer on music, and that should solve our problem. And we know that music, as we know it, is not really going to get into the classroom. Now, the children will really enjoy having a piano in the classroom. They'll evolve a kind of chopsticks culture and maybe a little bit beyond, but that's basically what we're getting right now. So part of what Mathland is, and part of what any kind of environment for doing rich learning in, is one in which the adults are invested in it as well. I think this is the biggest problem that we have to deal with, because obviously American technology can produce as many computers for as low a cost as we need. We can saturate the entire world with computers, but to set up a sense of what its special music is going to be very, very difficult. And I think that is what we should be aiming our efforts at. And I'd like to say one other thing, which is a rabbi famous for his wisdom in Europe was once asked why the Jews keep the Sabbath holy. And he said, because man is not a beast of burden. And what he meant by that was not just that you shouldn't work one day a week, but he meant that being human isn't primarily about working. So the most important thing here is to try and differentiate between all of the vocational demands that are being placed more and more heavily on society year by year by parents, by businesses, and what education actually means. If we take the pragmatic step of simply trying to deal with vocational problems and simply try and institute training via computers in our schools, we will lose the larger battle, and we'll lose it fairly soon. And it's in part because it is not nearly as difficult for people to learn how to do new jobs as it is for them to have the flexibility to have change be a part of their lives. One of the biggest problems is in today's business is not in the intelligence or ability of people to learn. It's in the sense of having a large enough worldview to see that there's more things in life than the job that they're doing right now. So I think that is a very important part. And the third thing I would like to mention is that even though television is so deeply embedded in our society, it now seems to be the environment that people are exposed to. I think it is one of the worst things in the quantity that it is viewed for helping children understand how large the world is. People like to say that people find out more from television now than they ever did in the past, but the problem is what they find out is trivial, simple, and has very little to do with the kinds of thinking they're going to have to do when they grow up. So learning is very entertaining when you do it, but entertainment often isn't particularly good learning. Maybe television should be the last technology that America produced that doesn't have a Surgeon General's warning on it. Something to think about. Now, my recommendations are kind of flimsy. And the reason is because, as Seymour points out, we have an enormous situated bureaucracy for running education in this country. And the biggest tragedy is within it are many teachers who are completely dedicated to helping their students' lives. But within this larger machine, I see very little chance of change in the direction that America needs. I think that is something that Congress and all of the people of this country are going to have to wrestle with for the next quite a few years. I think setting up goals such as America will be the first in the world in science and math, as President Bush did a few years ago, completely misses all of the points. One of the points it misses is that this is simply not possible. It takes decades to make changes from what has happened. And it's also misses the point about what the goals should actually be. The goals should be much more like this famous rabbi, which is that schools should not be just for learning how to make a living, but learning how to live. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kaye. Professor Dede.
I bring you good news and bad news about the future. The good news is that powerful learning technologies from high-performance computing and communications will enable K-12 schools to move to a new model of education, distributed learning. Distributed learning is centered on collaborative learning through doing, orchestrated across classrooms and homes and workplaces and community settings. America's information infrastructures are the crucial development that makes distributed learning possible, affordable, and sustainable. Knowledge webs, virtual communities, shared synthetic environments, and sensory immersion are 4 new technological capabilities shaping distributed learning. Knowledge webs give students access to experts, archives, and shared investigations. As with the World Wide Web on the Internet, links between chunks of information will help teachers and learners to interrelate and contextualize ideas. Virtual communities based on telepresence, the communication of emotion across barriers of distance and time, will encourage and motivate learners. For example, telementoring and teleapprenticeships will provide both the intellectual and the interpersonal support important in bridging from school to work. Shared synthetic environments will extend students' experiences by enabling learners and educators at different locations to inhabit and shape a common virtual world. This offers the possibility of learning through doing in virtual offices, factories, hospitals, and even imaginary environments similar to those on Star Trek's holodeck. Video game consoles capable of implementing these virtual experiences will be everywhere, even in poor and rural households. Advances in artificial reality will place students inside virtual worlds with intriguing things to see, hear, and touch. Such sensory immersion is powerful in deepening learners' motivation and their intuitions about physical phenomena. My current research centers on assessing the potential value of virtual worlds designed to teach material as disparate as electromagnetic fields and intercultural sensitivities. Using these and other new capabilities for distributed learning is crucial to enhancing the creativity, sophisticated thinking skills, ability to apply ideas, and motivation of K-12 students. This is vital for America's future economic well-being and for meeting the challenges of citizenship in a knowledge-based society. Given all these advances, what's the bad news? The bad news is that technological advances alone are insufficient to leverage educational change. In 1975, in the early days of microcomputers, accurate forecasts of the extent and power of today's technology would have seemed preposterous. Few would have believed that 2 decades later, desktop machines much more powerful than 1975 supercomputers would be routinely available in workplaces, schools, and many homes. That by 1995, these powerful available technologies would not have completely transformed schooling and learning would have seemed even more incredible. And yet widespread major gains in learning outcomes or motivation have not occurred, even though isolated examples of innovation through educational technology have demonstrated very significant effects. If all computers and telecommunications were to disappear tomorrow, education would be the least affected of society's institutions. Those who do not understand history are doomed to repeat it. 3 reasons that educational technology has made a limited impact to date are, first, the major focus of educational technology implementation has been automating marginally effective models of presentational teaching rather than innovating via new models of learning through doing. Second, education has been seen as something that happens through teaching students in isolated schooling settings rather than through empowering and interrelating learning in classrooms, homes, communities, workplaces, and via the media. And I would disagree somewhat with the prior 2 speakers. These 2 assumptions are not simply part of the education bureaucracy. These are deeply rooted in our culture. And the educational institutions that have made attempts to go beyond these 2 assumptions have often been repressed by the communities that they serve because parents and taxpayers and citizens also believe these 2 limiting things about education. And third, teachers and school administrators are overwhelmed by their current responsibilities, and they do not currently have the support systems necessary to reconceptualize their educational roles. So in brief, transforming education requires both building a top-down computing and communications infrastructure for our society and developing a second bottom-up human infrastructure of wise designers and educators and parents and citizens. My written testimony outlines changes in federal policy and federally sponsored research that would help to make this possible. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to share my ideas.
Thank you very much. Dr. Shaw.
Thank you. Let's see, do I have to do something here? There we go. I'm deeply honored to be here and also very excited. Honored because of my chance to address this body, but also very excited because I sense a confluence of interest in this area, which has been important to us for a long time now, both in the legislative branch now and in the executive branch, and also within the educational community and the educational research community and educational technology research community. And this makes me think that something is actually likely to happen, which is going to be very important for us over the years. I'm delighted to see Congress's interest. I want to make sure everyone knows that the White House is also very seriously interested. I've had the honor of serving as president of the panel on educational technology of the President's Committee of Advisors on Science and Technology, which has, first of all, brought me in contact with some of the people in the White House and in the Department of Education who are doing some remarkable work in this area, but also, and in some ways more important, brought me in contact with a number of the people out there who have been doing research and practicing in this area for a long time. And all of us, I think, have the sense that with bipartisan support, something important could happen now. What that importance actually is, I think, and I'll be echoing what all three of the speakers have said so far, has probably 20% to do with technologies and 80% to do with what we do with those technologies. Because we haven't said much about that, and I sense that there may be some interest in it, let me just sketch the quick futurist sketch of what may happen, but I'm going to do it very quickly, partly because of time limitations and partly because I think you've heard this so many times that the words will start to sound like obviosities. The first one is computing speed and power and memory capacity is going to go up dramatically over the next 20 years. We don't know exactly how fast because there could be unforeseen obstacles and unforeseen discoveries, but if I had to guess, I would guess that we'll have about 100 times the computing speed and memory capacity for an equivalent price by the year 2015. On the low end, we can expect to see the computing and memory resources that you'd find in the most powerful personal computer or workstation selling for well under $100, where the dominant cost is likely to be the actual I/O devices, the display devices and the data entry devices. And what that means is that when those costs dominate, we'll have to look to new technologies excuse me, like, for example, set-top TV boxes or handheld devices where we can get the cost down low enough that we can exploit the very low-cost computing power. We're also going to see dramatically increased communications bandwidth. The most obvious part of that is the Internet, which has caught the public's attention in the last year. My hope there is that we'll see Internet access become ubiquitous or nearly ubiquitous, and I'm particularly concerned with whether that's going to reach people in rural communities, in the inner cities, in some of the areas that, if we're not carefully looking at, are likely to fall victim to being part of a bimodal distribution of information haves and have-nots, and where we could actually exacerbate some of the problems that are besetting our communities right now rather than help them. But assuming we do have that, electronic mail is going to become nearly ubiquitous, at least for anyone with access to a computer. We'll expect to see that be at least as common as fax machines and fax numbers, and possibly even approaching telephones. And other sorts of communications should be made possible by the fact that we'll now be able to transmit not just short textual messages, but full motion video, high quality audio. In short, we'll be able to communicate in all the ways that we're used to doing, but over large geographical distances. Now, what does this actually mean to us? Actually, I think what it means is, really comes from an enabling technology and not from being central. If we focus too much on the raw technologies, even on such important things as connecting people to the Internet or getting a computer in every home, we may wind up in a situation where we have technology that's not being used at all, much less being effectively used. There are some things that are very important about computer-based technologies in education. One of the simplest ones, and one of the ones we learned about even in very early drill and practice-based systems, was that you could individualize instruction. Students could learn on a self-paced basis, so that rather than having the teacher focus on some hypothetical typical student, and then leave behind some of the students in the class and then have other ones be profoundly bored and have their attention wander, the student could keep its own, could, basically find his own pace or her own pace and learn things that wouldn't otherwise be learned. Different modes of learning, visual learning, verbal learning, and textual learning, which are idiosyncratic to individual students, are also supported by these technologies. But I think the most important kinds of changes that can be supported by these new technologies really have to do with entirely new modes of learning. And if I had to summarize those just based on the what I've learned in the past few months on the panel, I would say the most important things are that the student would assume a central role as the active architect of his or her own knowledge and skills rather than passively absorbing information that's proffered by a teacher who's sitting in the front of the classroom. Second thing would be that basic skills wouldn't be learned in isolation, but in the course of undertaking various higher world tasks and integrating a number of basic skills in the course of solving these real-world problems. Information resources would also be key, but the large importance of that really comes from having the student be able to access those when they're really needed to solve real problems, rather than have a forced centralized curriculum. I'd also expect to see fewer topics covered than is the case with the traditional sort of paradigm in education, but have those topics explored in more depth and in a very student-directed way. And finally, greater attention is likely to be given to the acquisition of higher-order thinking and problem-solving skills with less of an emphasis on the assimilation of large body of isolated facts. And that really represents a transformation in education itself. The use of technology there is profoundly important, but the use of the human beings who are participating in this process are also going to be transformed, in part because of technology, but in part they'll transform the way technology is used. Teachers will still be important, and for those of us who are expecting that we'll have an increase in productivity because aggregate teacher compensation will drop because computers will take over their jobs, that's not likely to actually happen. I think what's much more likely is the teacher will become a coach, a monitor, walking around the classroom, seeing what the individual students are doing, helping out in a very different role than before. The other thing that I think is going to be important is involving parents and the community. And technology, particularly to the extent that we have access in the homes, will be a key part in that also. If parents can communicate better with teachers, if teachers can communicate better with each other, if the community can be tied together, we're going to see repercussions not just for the community, but for the quality of education. As far as how we get there, I think this group and Congress in the large is going to have a major influence on whether it happens and how it happens. Unfortunately, some part of that has to do with spending. We're now spending about 1.3% of the education budget on technology. Best estimates are it'll take 3 to 5%, depending on exactly what we do. And what's more, the federal government now spends a disproportionate share of its education budget on technology. So if that becomes cut down, what we're going to see is much less technology in the schools. Even more important is research and evaluation. And that's particularly important because, first of all, we don't know what kinds of educational technologies work. And secondly, there's an economic externality. There's a good theoretical reason to believe that if this sort of research is not funded at the federal level, it won't be done. The reason is that if a private company does it, it won't be able to appropriate the full returns from its investment. If you develop a software product for education and it works, your competitors copy it, and your investment winds up dissipated among all of your competitors. We could do it at the state and local levels, but we'd have a similar free rider problem. In short, there's much that we have to do. Much of it has to be done at the federal level, and I hope we do that.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate all of your testimony. What we want to do is go to questions of members. We're going to enforce a 5-minute rule. We have lots of members here and lots of people on panels, so I'm going to try to have us live within a 5-minute rule for questioning. Let me begin with just a couple of questions here. Professor Papert, you said something to the effect that in the future that there's going to be a place where children learn, but it won't look like today's classroom. Would you give us an idea what you think it will look like?
Maybe it'll look like a research lab. Maybe it'll look like an active, creative architect's office. I think it'll look like a place where people are engaged, young people of mixed ages, because it's absurd that we should deprive 8-year-olds of contact with anyone except people at their own level of incompetence. Where people of mixed ages will be engaged in projects that are rich in knowledge and using the technology to research, get knowledge that they need in order to conduct long-term projects.
Doesn't that begin to look a little like the old one-room school?
I think the one-room school is a better model than the big, massive high school building, yes.
That's interesting. And would you agree with the point that Dr. Shaw made, that the teacher in that kind of setting becomes a kind of a coach, an information manager type of individual, rather than somebody who is imparting information as their prime function?
I agree with those words, but I'm afraid Mr. Shaw doesn't get it. I mean, I think his phrase that the teacher, I quote, will be a coach walking around the classroom seeing what the students are doing is a typical translation of a new concept into the old framework. There won't be a classroom. The teacher won't be walking around seeing what the kids are doing. The teacher might be part of this constructive project.
To be fair, most researchers now to whom I've spoken do not agree with Professor Peppard on this point.
I did preface my remarks. I think there's an education establishment that has its head wedged in a culture that grew up over a century during which there was the most lethargic progress in education of all fields of human activity, and they continue to suffer from being part of that culture. I think Congress ought to find some ways of planting seeds where there can be real radical change, real radical experiments, which are not subject to the consensus of the researchers and other members of the education establishment. In my written testimony, I suggest that you could use the Job Corps, for example, which belongs to the federal government, as a place where real innovation could be made without many of the difficulties that attend trying to introduce it into the classrooms. It wouldn't even cost anything. All you'd have to do is to free the bidders for Job Corps centers from the micromanagement of a sclerotic bureaucracy and let people who want to innovate there innovate.
I promised you a lively discussion, and it was... Let me go to the point that Dr. Shaw raised in terms of the specific terminology, but I think I heard it throughout all of your testimony, and I just want to make certain I did. Do I hear each of you saying in some form that what technology promises to be able to give us is the ability to individualize instructional programs, and that it will be based then on the students' talents, the students' abilities, the students' intelligence, what the student brings, and I assume that this would be in consultation with parents and so on as that instructional program would be designed?
No. We've got to give up the idea that learning is instruction. Instruction is a small part of learning. The important part of learning is doing. And I think the big change is that we will move from an emphasis in instructionist thinking to constructionist thinking.
But is it an individualized curriculum?
I think there'll be individualized activities which will be of such a nature that each individual will be able to draw on personal strengths.
And each student will not be learning the same thing as every other student.
Absolutely, that's
okay,
correct.
So that's individualized. Dr. Kaye, would you agree that that's a...
Yeah, I think if you look at 6-year-olds, they are the greatest mathematicians they'll probably ever be in their life. They're the greatest scientists they'll probably ever be in their life. They're really great in general, and if math and science and so forth were easy, we could just let them invent it. But we know that it took thousands and thousands of years to actually make real progress there. So the balance, I think, is that the students are inventive and creative, and when an adult is involved, what an adult can do is to have some sense of where things might be going. So the adults have some sense that the math might wind up in calculus some years down the road, and that could have something to do with the kinds of things that the kids are encouraged to look at. But the kids have to invent it for themselves, and the computer there can be a tremendous factor. I think nobody has been able to show yet a computer curriculum of any kind all by itself that when coupled with children will have the same effects as children in an atmosphere where adults really understand them and understand how to set up an environment in which all of their energies can be directed at learning, but where the outcomes are likely to be fruitful.
I'm going to try to stick by my own rules, and the buzzer is sounded for my time, so I'm going to go to Mr. Goodman.
One comment and one question. Like Chairman Walker indicated, an awful lot did sound like the one-room school that I attended, where Miss Yost planted the seed, and then she wandered around the room to see what we were doing to cultivate it. There were all ages together, and teacher today, of course, a good teacher could have them all the same age in the classroom, but the good teacher will have them at 6, 8 different levels, whether they're at a reading level in first grade or 5th grade, and they're still in first grade. It is still the same idea, but not a difference in age. But it does sound like the one-room school. But my question is, everything I've seen in education, we come along with new ideas and innovative technologies and so on. We generally institute them, and then we talk about training and preparing the teachers for the job. I haven't seen anything change, and perhaps Professor Peppert and Professor Deedy could respond. Maybe all of you could respond. Is anything changing in teacher education? I haven't seen anything, and I'm just wondering, if we make all the changes, is there anything going to happen as far as preparing the teacher or the observer or whatever we're going to call the person in the future to handle the situation beyond all the other responsibilities they've had put upon them?
There are slow changes taking place in teacher education, not as rapid as they need to be. And some of the answer for that is that the faculty of schools of education need to catch up to the 20th century. And some of the answer for that is that our mechanisms of accreditation and what parents and communities expect of teachers often force teachers back into older models of teaching. In a sense, we say, yes, we want a teacher that's innovative, but I also kind of want a teacher that was like the one that I learned so much from, that helped me to be successful in life. And I think that until we evolve in the minds of parents and taxpayers and community members a broader sense of what it means to do teaching and learning, and a shared responsibility for that, so that it's not a matter of dry cleaning where you drop off your student on the step in the morning and they come back brainwashed in the afternoon. When we get to a different and a more powerful model of that, then I think we'll see the pressures for changes in teacher education increase.
One of the things I mentioned was the piano as a metaphor, but could also say 150 years ago, the response was, let's put books in every classroom, and they are in every classroom. But in fact, most teaching is done from textbooks and is in accord with textbooks. Books are all about diversity of opinion and about learning at your own rate and about learning as deeply as you want. They're all about individualized learning, but textbooks are about lockstep learning. So this is a perfect example of a great educational technology starting some 400 and 500 years ago that has actually been co-opted into a much more of a party line from what it could be. And I believe that's exactly what is going to happen to computers. It's what's happening to computers in classrooms right now.
I think as far as the schools of education go, they're as sclerotic as the rest of the system and are not doing anything significant. However, I think that there are wonderful people in the profession of teachers, and I've seen some incredibly good learning conducted by individual teachers on their own time, with their own effort, And that's where I see the seed of real change. And some of the most interesting actions are the creation by teachers who are allowed in some school districts to start alternative schools where they can really pursue their own. A group of like-minded teachers can pursue a different philosophy of education and really carry it out. I think some of the wonderful things are happening in those areas, and one thing that could be done at a national level would be to foster that sort of allowing the teacher who puts the energy in to learn something new to be able to carry that into practice. Too often, sadly, I've had teachers really work incredibly hard for a whole summer in a workshop that we've run, and then go back to find that their excitement they're going to carry this out in their classrooms is frustrated by the system into which they have to go back. That's one of the most heartbreaking things I've seen, and I think if you can find a way to get around that by empowering those teachers, you will really plant some real seeds.
I was going to suggest that unfortunately oftentimes the creative or innovative teacher is restricted. And just one quick example, supervising student teachers in Pittsburgh when the so-called missile crisis was happening in Cuba, the headlines in the Pittsburgh paper said missiles could hit Pittsburgh, and I couldn't wait to get there to see all of my student teachers talking about this possibility for the first time, turning these kids on. Not one mentioned the headlines during the entire day, and that night when I took them to task, they said, oh, we were told that we must stick strictly to the curriculum. We can't deviate. So,
Mr. Brown.
Gentlemen, in the 1960s, there was a great upsurge of interest in radical ways of education. And much of it I'm sure you were familiar with. Classrooms without walls, getting involved in the community, that sort of thing. I had the pleasure of being associated with a radical teacher by the name of Ivan Illich, who 25 years ago invited me to participate in a school he was conducting in Mexico, where he had originally started out training Catholic priests for the service in Latin America, and he decided, and for part of the decision cost him his priesthood, that they had too many priests in Latin America and they didn't need to send more down there, and he changed his school into one that taught not only language but how to reform society. And this strikes me as being somewhat close to the message that may be coming from you, that it's not the technology so much, but how we can change the society and involve the students as a part of that society. I just ask you to comment on that and see if I'm anywhere close to being right.
Yes, well, I think it's both sides of that. The technocentric people who think that technology will solve it are totally wrong. But a little parable for the other side. Leonardo da Vinci invented the helicopter, but there was no way in which you could actually make one because you would have needed a whole lot of other infrastructure, material science, and all sorts of stuff that wasn't there. I think that there have been generations of really deep thinkers about education, including Illich, including my own professor, Piaget, who really saw dead on. They knew what to do, but there wasn't the infrastructure to be able to carry it out on a mass scale. So the ideas were there, the technology wasn't. Now we've got the technology, and too often it's divorced from the ideas. I think we can put these together. In my last book, The Children's Machine, I spelled this out somewhat, that in a sense the technology gives us today the infrastructure to put into practice ideas like learning by doing, learning by experience, coaching. All these are old ideas, but I think that for the same reason that Da Vinci simply couldn't have made a helicopter, however smart he was, these people could not put into practice. Our own American John Dewey, almost 100 years ago, said almost everything about education that we can say today, but it couldn't take effect because we didn't have the technological infrastructure.
And if I could build on that, I think one vital difference from the 60s is that parents and citizens see their workplace changing dramatically in a way that wasn't true then. And as a result, there's a growing consensus that the kinds of skills that are important in today's workplace are also important in today's classrooms.
Just one small sentence. Many of the writers of the Constitution thought that a new Constitution should be written every 20 or 30 years by each generation. This is Jefferson's view, is also the view of Tom Paine. That's a little radical, I think, but a slightly less radical way of thinking about it is what they really wanted was each generation of Americans to reinvest themselves in their democracy by thinking that they had a strong part of reframing it. So I don't think that's even a radical idea today, but I think it's actually very much in tune with what America has been about.
That's what the Republicans are trying to do today. Yeah.
Is that right? Okay, I'll have to study closer.
Illich's book was called Deschooling Society, and basically he took the whole system apart, not just the classroom, but the whole system that we you have any comments, Dr.?
Yes, one minor one. I think that connections between the classroom and education in general and the rest of society is actually quite important to the educational process. One of the things that we actually have some evidence about now is that students who are involved in real-world projects, and especially projects in which people in the outside world are depending on them for something, tend to be highly motivated. They tend to learn tremendous amounts, sometimes about only the very specific things they're working about, but they learn higher-order thinking skills that are extremely important. And one thing that I think that this means is that we have to have involvement in the educational process, not just on the part of educators and education schools. And if I can just use this as an excuse to interject this, I have to disagree very strenuously with what Seymour said about the education schools, that there's nothing interesting going on there. It's just an appalling remark. These are people who have given their lives to some very smart people to studying some of these problems. And my PhD advisor always said, whenever you see a body of people, even if you disagree with what they're doing, who are very smart and who are writing a lot of things, usually there's something there and you should try and understand what it is. I suspect that part of the problem is that it doesn't agree with Seymour's own particular model. But the fact is, I think we have to involve them. We also have to involve companies, and that's a key thing. While I've said that the federal government must do a lot, the fact is that the companies in our society now are going to have to pick up a big part of the burden. That's one of the reasons that the president just had a meeting 2 days ago with the CEOs of a number of the top American companies. George Lucas was there, Michael Eisner, Gerald Levin, Ted Turner, and the president, the vice president, the secretaries of education and commerce. The representation of Ron Brown there was an interesting one because it ties in education to society in two directions. One is to help education. The other direction, though, is that this administration is committed to education partly because if we're really going to have students who evolve to be able to hold 21st century jobs, high-wage, high-skilled jobs in the next century, it's not going to happen if they don't acquire those skills. So I think that there are a lot of reasons for having some very close ties between industry, educators, and the students themselves and their parents.
Thank you. It's a sign of my age, but I tend to think of previous explorations of this topic, and I'm reminded that Buckminster Fuller delivered a long lecture translated into a book later called Education Automation, which in my opinion was exactly the wrong way to go about changing education, but it was his effort to show how modern technology would affect education. And I'm sure this was 30 years ago that he delivered this lecture at Southern Illinois University.
Mr. Clay.
Thank you. Some of your technological proposals are quite revolutionary. But I guess the most radical idea that I'm hearing from each of you today is that there's still a role for the federal government in education. Let me ask you, Professor Dede, when we talk about the future of education here, are they doing the same thing in Europe and Japan? And if so, Can you tell us some of their relative weaknesses and strengths?
I think that all countries across the world are still somewhat mired in the idea that mastery of facts is somehow the fundamental goal of education. And if we look across the world at different systems, there is a disproportionate emphasis on standardized tests as the true metric for determining whether or not students are coming out prepared to succeed in life. And unfortunately, there's a lot of research that shows that those are a relatively poor indicator of how well people actually do 10 years later as parents, as citizens, as workers. What we are starting to see in Europe and Japan and countries across the world is a shift from the Just Like Me curriculum, where professors and try to create students who are really brought up just the way that they were, to sort of a just-in-time learning while doing curriculum that relies on more sophisticated measures, similar to those that David Shaw was talking about in terms of authentic experiences with problem solving, and then people from different roles judging how well students are doing in terms of that kind of problem solving. What we're beginning to see across the world is moving away from teaching what we know and how we know it to what to do when you don't know, and how you solve problems when you don't have all the facts at your disposal immediately. And as you know from your own experiences, we live in a world that's like that now. By the time we understand a situation, it's already changed before it's possible to act in full understanding of what's going on. So I think that there are ideas out of Europe and Japan that are valuable, but we have in many ways a unique culture and a unique economic niche in the world. And our challenge is to evolve a truly American response that relies on the fact that our schools are local rather than driven by a national educational system.
Thank you. Dr. Shaw, you were talking about 15 years or so from now about the cost of making sure we can reduce the cost of this technology. How cost effective is it now? Is there any idea what this would cost us if we implemented some of these ideas?
Yeah, the answer to that question is a complicated one. First of all, in terms of cost effectiveness, there is some data, but much of it is with older styles of pedagogical models, older styles of the use of educational technology. To answer that straightforwardly, we know that if what you want to do is teach a bunch of basic skills in isolation, you can do it faster and less expensively this way. I don't think that's actually what we want to do. In terms of what's likely to happen in the future, I think the best prediction, if we handle things correctly, would be that we're not going to significantly reduce the overall cost of education directly through the kinds of important things we're talking about. What we're going to be able to do is educate much better and give people much better ability to, as Professor Dede was saying, to solve the real problems they'll face later on in life when they don't know all of the answers. On the other hand, there are some things that technology are going to do pretty much automatically in terms of productivity. If we can get a handle on the organization within schools, some administrative costs are going to be reduced. There are certain areas where I think that will have an effect, but I think we have to be prepared for the fact that historically major changes in paradigm, even when they save a lot of money in the long run, in the short term actually result in a decrease in productivity. We're going to have to be prepared to spend some money to make that transition. So in the long run, I think that we're going to see a great deal of cost effectiveness, especially if you're interested in the outcomes and not just the total cost. But in the short term, I think it's misleading to have the simple productivity model where we will bring in computers, we'll automate a process in some way, and everything will become less expensive. But in some sense, we have no alternative. If the alternative really is that we train people to be competitive with textile workers in developing countries, then in the long run, that's not cost effective either. And if we look at this on an investment basis as opposed to an expenditure basis, even just looking at tax revenues alone, we should be able to get extraordinarily high rates of return from every dollar we spend at the federal level, because it's the highest level of taxing authority and it deals with the problem of economic externalities. That's the right level to do it. And we would expect to get many dollars back in the long run, not just through savings in education, but through increased productivity, through basically positioning ourselves in a way such that our country can be economically competitive and can retain the standard of living that we've all become accustomed to. This isn't strictly an economic problem. You know, we have to be prepared for the fact that if we don't educate, up until now, even though everybody talks about increased foreign trade, the fact is most of what happens just here locally in the country. That's going to change. We are going to have a truly international economy. Trade barriers are going to lower, and I think that's a good thing over time. But it also means that if we don't have the skills to compete for the kinds of jobs that are going to be at the top end rather than the bottom end of the pile, that we're going to have to be comfortable having the same sort of standard of living, at least for a large part of our population, that is characteristic of many less developed countries. And we don't have any experience as a democracy living in a society where perhaps 75 or 80% of the people earn what might be the equivalent of 30 or 40 or 50 cents an hour. That has never happened here, and it raises some important social and political issues. So we really have to look at costs in a very broad context. You know, when my daughter, who will be born in 11 days if all goes well, is 20 years old, we have no guarantee that she'll be in the environment she's in now, and the decisions you're making here about what our educational system will actually look like are going to make a huge difference in that.
Thank you.
Mr. Faywa.
The picture that I'm getting from you folks, and there seems to be a difference insofar as Dr. Pepper is concerned and the rest of you. If I construe what you're saying correctly, I think there was testimony that 20% of the problem is technology, but I should say 80% is what to do with that technology and the effective use of it, etc. And Dr. Pepper, is that correct pronunciation? Pepper. You seem to be saying that insofar as having the technology in the classroom, it won't be like that piano that I think Dr. Shaw referred to, where the kids might learn chopsticks, but perhaps not go too far beyond that. You seem to be saying, you know, stand back, get out of the way. We don't need standards. We don't need curriculum. Let the ideas and the technology spontaneously come together, and you're going to have some really creative education taking place. And I would like to believe that. I have trouble seeing it taking place. We haven't used much of the technology that has come forth so far in the classroom. It's been very difficult to do that even. But I'm not quite, I don't, what we really have to find out, it seems to me, is how do we get that technology, first of all, into the classroom? Is it cost, etc.? And then what do we do about enabling children, especially in the inner city, let us say, in rural areas, etc., in a position, first of all, to be able to begin to handle that technology in order to be able to have the access to all that the informational systems will give to us. Can you clarify my thinking a bit on that?
Yes, I can. First of all, I did not mean to say that simply putting the technology there would result in any spontaneously or automatically producing good changes, and certainly not. I don't think the problem is getting the technology there. It's certainly not in economic terms. In my written testimony, I do some arithmetic that shows that giving every child in the country a computer would raise the cost of education only by 2 or 3%, and that I don't think anybody questions that it would produce more than 2 or 3% in increased benefits. So
yeah, that I found that to be very interesting.
So it only appears to be expensive to schools because accountants have played tricks, and computers are in the same budget as pencils, and so they appear to be enormously expensive. But if you consider that many school districts, the one where in Cambridge, this is exceptional maybe, but they're spending $10,000 a year per child. And even in poor districts, they're spending $6,000 or $7,000 per year per child. And, well, you could buy a computer with a lifetime of 5 years would be for $1,000 or $500 if we really push the industry to do it, and that's $100 a year, and it's a negligible. I know Mr. Shaw is getting angry.
No, I'm not angry about this one. It's just not correct. Actually, 75 to 80% of the cost of the life cycle cost of a computer isn't the hardware. So that analysis isn't
but it's the
right.
What?
It's maintenance system. I agree with your point.
Let me make a point.
I just don't want to give unrealistic
I'm sorry,
numbers.
but it's exactly the problem is that you're thinking in terms of injecting the technology into the school system as it is. We have done experiments actually starting in colonial, in third world countries where there wasn't anybody you could pay to maintain them. The kids can learn to maintain the computers. If we only changed the curriculum, what they learn, so that they could maintain those computers, that would not be part of the cost. And the fact that you quote that, and it's quoted all over the place, shows how people are interpreting the new ideas in terms of an old framework, and so come to misleading conclusions. And that's my whole thesis that I'm trying to push here, that you need systemic thinking. You need to understand that all these questions, such as how the thing gets maintained, what the kids learn, how the school is structured, all these have to be taken together as a whole. So, I think the kids could possibly even make the computers or assemble them. There are all sorts of ways if we really change. But it needs to be explored. And if you look in the literature...
No, it actually doesn't. That's not a very good idea. Now, I agree with your main point, and I think we have to look at systemic changes, but representing to Congress that for $100 a year we can put computers in the school is not doing a service. I actually think it's a very good idea, the idea of getting students involved in maintaining the computers and doing systems administration, actually not in the low-level manual labor, but in many of those tasks. And I think it's a good idea, not largely for economic reasons, but because there's considerable evidence that that's actually a valuable educational experience. But we're kidding ourselves if we think that one of the problems actually in the real world right now is that states are evaluating the purchase of computers as if they were capital expenditures, in the same way they do when they buy a building and they issue a bond issue and they project a useful life. The useful life of a computer, first of all, isn't 5 years right now. It's 18 months in industry. Best projections are it would be 2 to 3 years in the schools, and we can probably involve the students in some aspects of maintenance.
An interesting
but it will
debate.
Not,
Sorry,
it will not mean a zero
I know
cost.
schools where innovative...
It's the Congress.
Well, I apologize.
Will the record show that Dr. Pepper figuratively was pulling hairs out of his head?
Perhaps,
Just so they're not out of my head.
Perhaps we can continue the debate with the next questioner, Mr. Sawyer.
Thank you.
Mr. Romer was here.
I only do what they put in front of me here.
Well,
They have him next.
thank you, Mr. Chairman. It was a wonderful debate, and I don't really want to change the subject because it was going so well. But I am interested in a topic that Mr. Goodling touched on, and that our answers touched on, but didn't really get much beyond. That's the question of what we mean by who we assign whatever the equivalent role of teacher is. We talked about teacher credentialing and teacher preparation, but it seems to me that if we're looking at that role, it is a role that is changing in itself, that we're continuing to talk about credentials which, issued at the beginning of career, are sufficient for a 30-year duration at a time when change is a fundamental characteristic of the age that we're in, and where we're really not talking about applying the same kind of seminal thinking to the development of those skills that we bring to whatever is the equivalent of classroom, that we are to the application of the technology in learning itself. And so what I really want to ask you about is what we seek to prepare teachers to do, how we make that a more continuous process throughout a career. The whole business of the kind of model that we use is it a Socratic model? Is it a matter of posing questions and framing problems? What becomes the purpose for which we are preparing people to function
as somebody
in
who works
this
in a
environment?
teacher preparation institution, let me try to answer that question. Historically, some of what we've done with teachers is we've said you need to know your subject and you need to know something about instruction. And much of what you're hearing from the panel is that, yes, it's important to know something about your subject, but that subjects now are blurring across a whole range of things that apply to authentic problems, and that knowing something about instruction is perhaps less important than knowing something about learning and being able to think like a learner and being able to facilitate learning. In business, often what we see now in effective organizations is a community of knowledge in which employees don't know everything that they need to when some novel problem comes along, but they work as a team, they reach outside of the organization. The really effective employees, the workers and the managers, are good at learning how to learn and organizing people to work in teams. And I think that some of that is the new role of the teacher. But what's different between the workplace and the classroom or the learning setting is that the children are not adults, and that often the teacher has to be able to think like a child as well, and to recognize developmental stages, and to recognize how to phrase something in a way that's appropriate for the child rather than appropriate for a peer. So I would characterize the kind of shift that's taking place in teaching as partly a spreading out of subject matter to not narrowly specialize, partly understanding how to organize and create a community of knowledge that may reach outside of the classroom, and partly understanding learning in a deep way as it's appropriate developmentally for the students that you're working with.
I like to disagree in a fundamental way. First, with your supposition. I went to school 50 years ago, went to first grade 50 years ago, and I think somewhere around second grade I realized that my teachers actually didn't know very much about mathematics. I was getting interested in it. My father was a scientist, and at some point I realized, gee, my teacher actually doesn't know. I know more than my teacher does right now. And the problem was the teachers didn't know that they didn't know. Will Rogers said the problem is not what we think we don't know, but what we think we do know. And science has made its way by being very careful about what it doesn't know and very, very careful about what it thinks it knows. And I think that the real change in teachers that should happen is that teachers shouldn't think that they know their subjects, because nobody can, and it hasn't been true for hundreds of years. It's the biggest problem is that teachers, knowing a little bit, think they actually know enough to teach you.
Precisely the point behind asking the question in terms of giving a credential at the beginning of a 30-year career.
What I'm saying, it's always been true, I think, or at least it was true 50 years ago. And so the critical thing for teachers is not so much to be trained in their subjects, but to be trained in what they don't know. That is, to have a good sense. For instance, every scientist that I know of is pretty darn humble about what they think they know in their own field, because they've learned enough to realize that their ignorance is abysmal, and in fact our ability to characterize the world is not nearly the way it's portrayed on television. And so what you need is an opposite kind of person. You need a person who is constantly saying, I don't know, but let's see how this turns out, rather than a person that says, well, I do know, and this is the party line. I think that is the critical change. And once a person takes that attitude, then they are actually much better at their subject than they ever were before, simply because they're open to touching more areas of it.
I think we've come to...
I think the same thing, but a nice phrase, I think. Schools are really not very good, are bad places for children to learn, because they are bad places for teachers to learn. And if we can change the school into a place where what they're dealing with isn't multiplication tables, but exciting subject matter, the teachers would be learning as well as the students in the same process. And that's the only answer. And if there's any credential we would like teachers to have, it's to be good learners. And I think the trouble is you can take a lot of courses about how to be a good teacher, about instructional theory and the pedagogy. We don't even have a word in English for the art of being a good learner, as we have, what is to learning as pedagogy or instructional sciences to teachers, to teaching. I think if teachers were, if they're going to be credited for anything, it's for being good learners so that they can participate in the learning process, model the learning process, set the example. I don't think they need to know about learning, they need to be good at it.
I think the observation goes back to teacher training again. The elementary teacher expected to teach all subjects, very little, if any, math in high school and no math in college, and all of a sudden they're out there. But at any rate, Mr. Romer?
Do you want to go back to your...
No, you're next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We'll try to get back to that healthy debate that was one of the most entertaining parts of this whole hearing between Dr. Papert and Dr. Shaw. Yeah, you haven't said anything for a while. We'll try to get you back into the debate here. Let me say first of all, in prefacing my remarks, that I believe that we don't need to tinker with the schools either. That we need some basic transformation in our schools. We have many problems there. Technology certainly is not going to be the panacea for all our problems. And let me, as Dr. Papert did, tell two parables, and one of them will be a question and then get into the other one. The first one is bragging about my son a little bit. I have a 2-year-old that can get onto the computer, can turn it on, turn on Broderbond software and get into the CD-ROM of Play School. He loves it, helps him count and play games and learn so much. It's incredible technology. To what degree are we putting so much emphasis on even these 2-year-olds and 12-year-olds being entertained and having this learning and academic technology? To what degree are we overestimating it? And let me say that when we said that we thought television would be such a great tool in our schools, and Channel 1 and all these things were going to be the latest innovation to help us transform teaching and learning, it has not transpired. Now, certainly, as Dr. Papert or Dr. Kay might say, we need to transform the infrastructure out there, not just the school and teacher. How can we get this technology, whether it be Broderbond or Edmark, whether it be different computers, whether it be the hardware or the software, to go the route to help us achieve this dream that we're talking about this morning, and not go the route that so much commercial television has, where they categorize the Jetsons and the Flintstones as educational television. I think on TV, PBS and maybe Nickelodeon are the only TV stations that are doing much to challenge our children. Dr. Shaw, where do we go to make sure that the private sector and the commercial end of this fulfills this dream that we're seeing?
Well, I've asked exactly that question over the last month or so of at least half of the CEOs of the large educational software companies in our briefings. And the answers differed in some respects, but there were a few things that were brought up that were in common. First of all, just to understand the basic situation, the reason that the vast majority of the software development effort has gone toward the home market as opposed to the school market has been in part that it's very difficult to sell to the, for various reasons, very difficult to sell to the school markets, much easier to sell to the home markets. One problem is fragmentation. Right now, many different states and different regions have different standards for adopting software, some of them very stringent. For the home market, you just produce a product, and if you advertise it and it's a good product and it gets good reviews and so forth, people buy it. It's much more complicated within the school systems. The exact solution I'm not sure of, but that is one of the problems that they face. Another one of the issues that they're facing now is just the availability of hardware. About 40% of all of the machines in the schools right now are Apple IIe's, I believe. I know Apple, early Apple machines, for which essentially no software is still being written. Because it's too expensive to write for many platforms. This is not a criticism of Apple, which is doing wonderful things in education. It's a reflection of some of the economic problems involved in getting modern computer equipment into the school and maintaining them. Many of the computers that we do have, even contemporary ones in the schools, are not being used, partly because of teachers not understanding them, but partly because they don't have the resources to keep those maintained. And in fact, one of the things the President just announced was something called the Tech Corps, which is going to be focusing on having private sector volunteers provide assistance to the schools to solve some of those problems. It remains to be seen how much of the problem that solves, but at least it's one issue where I think bipartisan support would be very useful. And then the other thing is research. In terms of understanding what's popular and what's fun to play with at home, there are some fairly easy ways to do that. You use focus groups, you try selling things on a sample basis, and you see what sells. In terms of achieving specific educational outcomes, we have to have a better sense for what the right criteria are. Standardized test scores are fine if what you want to do is raise standardized test scores. If you want to develop other kinds of thinking skills, you need to be able to specify what those objectives are. Once we have those, there'll be a target for the software companies to shoot for. That will be very helpful. Now, I don't think there should be one target. We need experimentation. We need, thousands of flowers blooming to see what the free market does, to see what teachers want to adopt, to see what works in the classroom. But I think there's a real role for the government in stimulating that without subsidizing it. The software companies don't want money. They'd like some other things that will help them produce for those markets.
Well, I'd like to say something directly on the question you asked about whether the kind of software that's accessible to your 2-year-old child doesn't overvalue certain adult skills like learning numbers and so on. And I think.
Are you saying, Doctor, that my 2-year-old is smarter than I am already? Is that what you're trying to do?
Well, I think that. Well, I've often said that one of the troubles with our education system is that we're trying to hurry along children to think like adults, whereas we'd do much better if we got more adults to think like children, who have a kind of creativity and intellectual honesty that we could all try to emulate. But that aside, I think there's an important point here. That is, I think it's wonderful to see these kids doing that sort of thing. But something that concerns me is that there's a kind of emphasis on factual skills, on learning these number skills, on getting the right answer, which the children enjoy. But I think that it's got some of the defects that have been identified with video games where you shoot games to kill. Games to drill are often just as bad. And what I would like to see, and I think it's a bit long to say why this isn't happening, but what I think will happen, what should happen, is a kind of software environment where parents and children can engage together in common constructionist creative activities. And my model isn't that the home computer, which most of the software does, will take over the job of the teacher drilling the kid in how to add numbers, which I think is extremely unimportant for kids of that age to learn. I think a better model is in the old days when fathers supposedly used to buy these train sets so that they could really enjoy them, and that the model of the parent and the father and the child really working together on making a railroad layout, so they're really working together on a common thing. I think this is the image that I would put forward, and I think this has to do with creating family solidarity around learning. I think part of this talk about generation gap, the answer to that is to say to parents, get in there with your kids.
Right. Well, actually, to be fair,
them as teachers.
Mr. Ehlers.
If I could just conclude, Mr. Chairman, just to be fair to the software program that I quoted on Broderbund, they have about 12 different programs. About 6 of the programs are not numbers and alphabet. They are creativity. There isn't a right answer to give. And out of those 6, about 2 or 3 of them are games that you can play with your child, that I can get on the computer at the same time he can, and we can play together, not at looking for one answer, but building things and using your creativity. So already some of those things are being done.
Of course. I don't want to say all things are bad, but I think that's the direction where we need a lot more emphasis. Yeah.
We, unfortunately, for the two panels who will be coming later, they'll be looking up here and wondering where everybody is. Where everybody is, yeah, where everybody went. And this getting the families together is wonderful. I'm all for it. I keep reminding everyone that a large percentage are dysfunctional families. And Mr. Ehlers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I apologize. I was gone for a little over a half hour. I had to give a speech elsewhere, and I would like to reserve my time at this time until I get back into the sync of what has been said and what some of the questions are. So,
Mr. Cunningham.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm very proud. I've got a nephew that just graduated last year from MIT with a scholarship in computer science. And I know the advantages of the programs they have. And let me speak in to the members of the panel as to the problems in California. We have almost 1 in 8 Americans lives in our state. And we've got, across the nation, less than 12% of the classrooms have a single phone jack to hook up. I talked to AT&T, Bell, Corning, to see what it would cost to put fiber into the different programs. And the problem is that you can hook up every single school, but AT&T, I believe, has got about 75% fiber, but the baby bells are limited. So right now, even if you hooked up all the schools, you can only talk school to school. And there's a monumental problem in the things that we have to face. What I would like to take a look at in the side of the Pentium chip and 486s are now obsolete, why we have not invested into those systems. Why are we having regular school programs canceled? And again, I'd like to look at it kind of a perspective of what our problem is from the state of California. I look at, and I'm not saying this to inflame anybody in any group, but to show why the revenue sources, in my opinion, are not there. We talked about the school lunch program. I've got about 400,000 illegals, kindergarten through 12th. There's actually about 800,000. I use the term 400 so they can't hit me on the figures. But take the school meals program at $1.90. Take just 2 meals instead of 3, because they are 185% below poverty level. That's $1.2 million a day just on illegals in the school system. Then I look, it takes $4,000 to $5,000 to educate a child a year. Take that times 400,000, you look at $2 billion. We've got 18,000 illegal felons in our prison system. Then you look at the children being born in the hospitals and the cost to increase in all the health care and stuff. That's one area. The defense cuts, $177 billion in defense cuts. Base closures have cost California over 1 million jobs in both military and defense-related. 93% of education is funded through state tax dollars, so that's 1 million people there that are not funded. Then we have the spotted owl for the timber industry. We got the gnatcatcher for construction. We've got the water and the salmon for the farmers, and all of these are jobs that are not paying into our education system to finance the things that we want to do. And the end result is, with all the job losses, what do you have to do in the state? You have to raise taxes on the remaining businesses, and it's driving jobs out of California because of all of these different things. Then we've got our own share of natural disasters. And so what I'm saying is that we, especially in California, have got a monumental problem. And the remaining 7% of the federal, the question was asked, does the federal government have a role? Yes, but we only fund 7% of education. But with that comes 50% of the rules and regulations on the states that keep them from doing the things that we want to, and over 75% of the paperwork, which causes you to hire people and take dollars away from what we're trying to do. I truly believe that on a bipartisan measure that we can eliminate a lot of these barriers and work toward the things that we want to do. I have a high-tech fair. The tech is there. We hooked up computers with Paris, France, and the kids and the parents and the teachers dialed in and got the technology and talked in English, and it was transposed over to French and vice versa. And it doesn't have to be expensive. I think some of my Democratic colleagues have had a game called Challenge 24 in their districts. I mean, it's not high tech, but it's really innovative. And I disagree with the gentleman that it's not teaching, it's just doing. We just had the Teachers Awards for Teacher of the Year Award. And I tell you what, there's some very innovative teachers out there in good school systems, from the highest tech schools on down the line. But I know that the president just went through and conducted a PSPR swing through California. It's a political speech and press release swing. And when they asked him, because he said he was going to put the computers and the technology into it, we asked him how. He didn't know. But I would say to the gentleman that we can take off some of the controls that the federal government has, do away with the bureaucracy, solve some of the problems that I aforementioned, and we'll have the dollars to invest. But we need industry. We need the AT&T and the Bells to invest. A profit is not a dirty word to this side of the aisle.
Time of the gentleman has expired.
And we need your help to coordinate with science. Thank you.
Ms. Woolsey.
Chairman, for anybody that knows me on this committee, everybody would know that I believe education has to be the #1 priority in this nation. And I also believe that we won't be able to achieve that unless we get technology in the classroom. Fortunately, I represent an area, Marin and Sonoma County, just north of the Golden Gate Bridge, where a Broderbund is established, Autodesk, George Lucas, Hewlett-Packard. So I'm very fortunate that I get to pick the brains of some very knowledgeable people on an ongoing basis. Just last week, I held a meeting in my district with 55 educators and users of technology and innovators and manufacturers in my district. And we sat down and we talked about what we were going to talk about today, what should be the vision in the year 2000 for technology in the classroom, and how long is it going to take to get there, and what we need to be doing. And we broke our issues down into 4 parts: equipment and materials, training educators, infrastructure, and uses of technology. And in 2.5 hours in the morning, I guess it was because it was morning, we really got going. We accomplished a lot. And one of the things I want to ask you, and I'll start with you, Dr. Shaw, you're going to have this little baby girl in 11 days. Are you assuming that she's going to be computer able? I mean, are we going to assume that every child is going to be able to use a computer if we provide? I mean, if the answer is yes, should we assume that?
Well, I think we certainly assume that. Personally, my wife and I both use computers as a tool all the time. Incidentally, my PhD is in computer science, but what I actually use the computer for is probably what many of the people in this room use it for, as a word processor and for electronic mail. Those are the main things.
So it's a part of your life. But I mean, we're assuming this child... See, one of the participants in my workshop last week was a student, a senior in high school, who has his own computer company. Talk about a bright kid. He should be here, too. And he said that every student isn't computer able, and we're kind of making a mistake by assuming that. But my next question would be, if we can assume that most students are going to be computer able, where are we going to start to ensure that every student has access? Every student, not just those born to smart people like Tim Romer here, whose kid's already smarter than he is. I mean,
go too far on it.
Well, look, I mean, we are so privileged here, but how about the less privileged? How are we going to make sure that every child, and this is one of George Lucas's visions, every child has a computer, not just in their classroom, but at home, like a book, have access, have the infrastructure, can stay current. How are we going to do that?
I think we can do that, but I don't think that's even really the point, because we already have free public libraries all over this country full of most of the content of our civilization. And most of the content of our civilization 4 years from now, in the year 2000, is still going to be in those libraries. It's not going to be on the internet. And I believe that we have a country that is very, very far from being reasonably literate.
Well, does anybody else want to answer to that?
Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, that's
So I'm saying the access, we can make computers all over the place. We can make them cheap. We can hook kids up so everybody has universal access. But what I'm saying is they already have universal access to the stores of our civilization, and our educational system is supposedly set up to teach them how to make that connection. And it's failing at that. So the calls for universal access to computers kind of...
So that's an assumption that we start all over from scratch, which we need to rethink a lot of things. But I want to talk about, I don't want to...
You want to talk about the new stuff instead of what we haven't been able to do with the old stuff.
Right.
But don't you see that the same thing is going to happen?
I hope not, and that's what
you
we
hope
need to
not.
be looking at.
Well, okay.
Where do we go further with this? One thing, do you believe that teachers should have to teach themselves? I mean, somebody said that teachers can teach themselves.
It's the only way you can learn.
I mean, then we expect every teacher, without any support from the rest of us, to leave their classroom, go home, leave their kids, and go teach themselves. I mean, don't we need to get our culture going in a direction that would be part of their job, that we provide them the support and assistance?
I was the one who said about teachers teaching them. I didn't say that they ought to. I said that they do, and they're doing them, and that minority of teachers, a substantial minority, are doing a great job of learning.
But how do we expand that?
I think the problem is not to expand it. I think that the problem is to create some very compelling models that can set an example and change people's thinking. Unless you can change the whole public's thinking about what constitutes learning and what constitutes school, you are not going to get real change. So I think the point is to make models, and I don't know where. And I gave one example that break out of this K to 12 and use your own Job Corps that belongs to the federal government as a model where we can set up really innovative, different technology-based, technology-fluent learning. And that's just one example. I think that we could change public opinion very quickly. Not very quickly, it'd take a few years because that's the time that it needs to see effects. But as long as we're tinkering with the system and trying to see how can you get whole school districts or whole states to do something, you can only do a common denominator that's pretty close to zero. And it's all like, one more parable, it's like somebody invented the refrigerator but only could afford to make one that would reduce the temperature by ½ a degree. And so everybody decided refrigerators are pretty useless things, and this is what we do generally in our experiments in education. And it's not going to convince anybody.
Well, I mean,
you're in a position where you could make some models. Time
of the gentlelady has expired. Mr. Fattah.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, first of all, I really want to thank the panel for sharing their input. And I hope that the Congress will take much more of an interest in this matter. The vast majority of our spending on education at the federal level has nothing to do with advancing the use of technology in education, only a very small percentage of those dollars. So if, in fact, we have heard much of what you've said and what is in the literature today, maybe we'll do more about that. It seems that in the near-term future, though, we're going in the reverse direction. That is that the Congress is going to be taking action in this year's budget to actually be cutting some of the technology programs. I'm thankful that on yesterday we were able to announce a $5 million grant to the Philadelphia School District, my school district, to move technology hopefully forward. But I'm fearful that that won't be the case in many other districts around the country. I do want to say a couple of things and ask a question that I think that the ranking member, Congressman Clay, asked that really wasn't responded to. we're not playing football against ourselves. We're not shadowboxing here. We are in a global competition, which you talked about. In terms of our economic competitors, the response to his question in terms of a comparative analysis of our educational systems, especially as it related to technology, but in general, it was kind of like, well, we have a local model and they have a national model, and that was it, as if, therefore, there was no need to really make a comment about whether they are ahead of us, behind us, achieving more or will be in the future. And I think that we really deserve a response from such an enlightened panel on such an important question. I know that we've heard a lot today about a range of issues, including dysfunctional families. We have a president and a speaker who come from broken homes. They've managed to make it, and hopefully we can help other children in our country, notwithstanding whatever position they start out in, to end up living up to their potential. So I'd be interested in hearing about this comparative analysis with some of our economic competitors. Thank you.
If I could just say a little bit about that. One of the things that's very well documented, of course, is that our country recently has not been doing so well according to the measures that are usually applied. Those measures are very questionable, but I think it's fairly clear that it's not just for reasons of spending. Our educational system hasn't been delivering what we'd hope. We spend something on the order of $6,500 per student, which is actually relatively high compared to many industrialized nations, and that places us fairly low in the rankings. So there is an issue there of why why we're not getting more for our money. One thing to look at is the whole question of how much of that is going for research. Just to compare this to the pharmaceutical industry, for example, America spends about $70 billion a year on prescription and non-prescription drugs, and about 23% of that amount is spent on research to find out which drugs are efficacious and safe to use. Comparing that to education, at the state, federal, and local levels, we spend a total of about $285 billion, an enormous amount on education. Far less than 1% of that is spent figuring out what actually works in education. And in fact, within the Department of Education, because of the way the money has been allocated, they have a $30 billion budget, of which only about $50 million, so a trivially small percentage, is used figuring out what actually works. So part of what I think we have to do is to not just blindly spend more money, but to look very carefully at what we want to do in our schools and how we can do that cost effectively, and to make sure, as several of the members have mentioned, that happens on a universal basis. There are very serious equity issues. If we're not careful, we could exacerbate the differences between those people in our society who are most advantaged and those who are most disadvantaged. If we are careful about it, we may tend to close that gap.
I appreciate that, but my question is not about the comparative nature of our spending, or what I'm looking for is in terms of the use of technology and advancing education. Are the Japanese, are the Germans, are others doing better than we're doing? Are they about at the same place in this competition, if you will, in terms of developing the next generation of genius? Where are we at in this playing field?
Yeah, my understanding is that some other countries are spending more to investigate some of these areas, but I think some of the other panel members may know more about some of what's going on there.
I've traveled to 9 different countries for the U.S. Information Agency, looking at what they're doing with educational technology. And there are some very sophisticated programs in language learning that other countries have developed because they tend to be multilingual societies that we could learn much from and that would be important in terms of our global economic competitiveness. But once you look outside of that area, by and large, they have been much more interested in the educational technology and the software that we've been developing than they have had things that they could share with us. By and large, the world software market is driven by American innovations.
The time of the gentleman has expired. The chair would say to the members that we have a continuing long list of members, and we do have several more panels. I have a list of people as they've come in. We would still have 4 or 5 members to question this panel, and I will go in order. I guess what I would ask is whether or not there are people who could defer from this panel to others. If possibly you can do that, we'd like to be able to get all of our witnesses on. Yeah, that's right. What we will do is in the next panels we will go and take you in order, and so you will be first, then anybody who reserves, as I understand Mr. Ehlers did earlier. The next person on my list is Mr. Gutnick.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I will try to be brief, but we've heard a lot about, and my background, I served in the state legislature for 12 years, and we had a lot of debate about, computers in the classroom and how much we should be spending per student and student to teacher class ratios and all of those things. And that's all interesting, and I think that all does have some impact. But frankly, and I think in the last discussion, Dr. Shaw talked about approximately $6,500 per pupil unit is what we're spending nationwide. But one issue that does not get talked about much, and it did come up, I think Professor Deed used the term a couple of times in his presentation to begin, the term motivation. And I think that that's an area that we seem to sort of dance around, but my observation has been that there are some kids out there who are just overachievers, and you literally, if you teach them how to read and maybe to use a computer keyboard and turned them loose for 12 years, they would be fine. But there's another group of students out there that somehow we're just not reaching, and it seems to be worse in some schools than others. And perhaps any of you would want to comment on how do we tackle that problem? How big is that problem? And how do we tackle it, and what role can technology ultimately really play in getting to some of these kids? And what I'm really talking about, too, in part, is because I serve on the Washington, D.C. Oversight Subcommittee, and I'm concerned and alarmed about the schools here in this city. And some might argue that we're not spending enough money, but based on some of the information we've seen, we're spending an awful lot of money on the schools here in Washington, D.C. And yet, and I don't know how accurate this is either, but we're told that about half of the kids that begin in kindergarten will not graduate from the D.C. schools, and of those who do graduate, less than half of them will be able to read at an 8th grade level. So it's not money, and I don't know, maybe they need more computers, but somehow I think somewhere along the line we're losing that motivation link.
John Holt said that it'd be so much easier to teach mathematics if we made it illegal. So one of the ideas is that there's a kids culture and there's also an adult culture, and generally children are very interested in learning things important in both of those cultures. Sometimes people have advanced the idea that learning mathematics is hard or learning science is hard, and that's why some kids don't do it, but shooting baskets is hard and there's a lot of failure in it. Hitting a baseball is really hard and you fail most of the time, and most kids will almost turn themselves inside out to learn things that they think are important, even though there's an unbelievable amount of failure involved in these difficult things. So many years ago, Maria Montessori, when she set up her schools, set them up in such a way as to let the children's own natural interest in what was around them drive most of the processes. And then her job, she felt, was to design the environment so that the kids' collision with that environment, driving on their own natural motivations, caused the kinds of learning that she hoped would happen. So you could say that the kids had wants and Maria Montessori had needs. And she was trying to collide those two together so that the kids' wants provided the motivation and her needs were expressed in the apparatus that she built for the kids. The Macintosh user interface used Montessori's ideas so that as people try to do things, they also learn about many more things than they might have gotten out of a manual. So this is an old idea that is a very, 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 very good one. I think the hardest thing in schools is to make most of the things that schools try to teach be part of any kind of a society that children can recognize. And sometimes the ones who seem to have the greatest learning problems are the ones who have figured out that it's a fake the best. Herb Cole wrote an excellent little book called I Won't Learn From You, and it was when he discovered that some of his students actually could read quite well, but they wouldn't show him that they could, because there was much more going on than just a learning situation. And so I think the motivation part really the strongest thing we can do is to set up, as Seymour has pointed out, environment. When a child sees a teacher actually learning rather than just teaching, or an adult, their parents learning about something, that's something they want to do. The children do want to do what the adults do, but when they see teachers not wanting to learn, why should they themselves, unless they have that special spark that you were mentioning?
I'd like to add a concrete example to that, and it's on the theme that everybody is motivated to do what they want to do. And a lot of kids think video games are wonderful things. Now, there's a cheating way of using that by building into the video game that it's going to teach you the multiplication table, but kids aren't dupes and they don't fall for that. Another way is to give kids the opportunity of making their own video games by giving them enough access to computers and the knowledge, and there's a lot of stuff. It's not just, there's programming, there's how to organize a complex project, there's the geometry of movements. We have seen inner city kids go ape about that opportunity to be able to make a video game. And they are highly motivated, and they learn an incredible lot of other stuff. Only in order to do that, you've got to give up the idea that the way to learn is to fit into the school compartmentalization of knowledge, because if you're making this game and you need some geometry in order to make something happen on that screen, you need it now when you've got the problem there, and not when it says in the curriculum that this is the day to learn that particular thing. So this involves a radically deep restructuring of our thinking about what school is about and how we do things there. I think that those kids you're talking about, it's not that school has failed to motivate them, school has demotivated them. Because what you do at school is fundamentally boring. And it matches some people's intellectual style to do that, and those kids do well. The others are profoundly discriminated against, and I guess it's only a matter of time before somebody will see this as a constitutional issue, that school is in itself a profound discrimination against everybody whose intellectual style doesn't happen to fit that very systematic, subordinating way of learning.
Another piece of this is social. There are kids who are not going to be very interested in objects, but to the extent that technology can become a social medium for them, it can provide a focus for collaborative learning, it can provide a focus for reaching across distance into a virtual community, and that's a very important part of motivation.
Time of the gentleman has expired. We were just talking up here, we think that maybe there's already a term in education out there for it. It's called attention disorder. For the civil right that you're describing, Professor. The next person is Tim Petri.
I want to thank you very much. Going through my mind as I listen to the testimony and the questioning is what the federal government can do at the end of the day that is helpful, and what it should avoid doing that is counterproductive or actually harmful. And in that connection, I appreciate your comments on that, because it's been my impression, serving on this education committee for some years now, that we have a lot of very good intentions and we come up with a lot of very good programs, but at the end of the day, they're run through a bureaucracy which, whatever the premise of or purpose of the issue is, has the net effect of diverting people's attention, empowering people who don't really understand what that good intention is, but do understand filling out a piece of paper or hiring more people to regulate the flow of money. And we've just built a big bureaucratic machine with best of intentions, which may, in fact, be part of the problem. And so I don't want to see us, unless you guys think it's a good idea, to use the rationale if we need to have more modern technology, we need this new thing in the education system, so let's set up a big program and hire some more people who probably will do no better than we've done with 3 or 4 other major national pushes in this area. Could you comment on that? I mean, we want to be helpful, federal government, but we do have some clear problems in education, and whether doing it top-down beyond the bully pulpit is really constructive or not is something I'd like to
I understand future in this town means 2 years, but it's going to take a little bit. So a short-term kind of thing that might help would be something like the following. The successful widespread of powerful ideas in some school districts I've seen. For instance, the Pasadena School District has one of the best elementary science programs. It was done by a couple of scientists at Caltech, kind of in their spare time, and it got bigger and bigger and better and more organized, and it's in the whole school district for the last 5 or 6 years, and it's really excellent. And they had to do it without being able to turn any of the elementary school teachers into scientists. But what they did is and this is, you'll find, I think if you go around the country, you'll find very similar structures in other successful areas. What they did was they came up with a combination of what the elementary school teachers do in the classroom, combined with district circuit riders who were scientists, who really had a sense of this. And basically what they wanted to do was to have